Hey there, everybody. It's Charlie Angus of the Resistance Network, and we are about to make a big announcement, and that announcement is going to come on Labor Day. Why Labor Day? Well, Labor Day is a really important day for us at the Resistance because resistance isn't just a term. It's not something you see painted on the wall of some downtown building. Resistance is about the actual concrete steps that very ordinary people take to say they're not going to be pushed around anymore. Resistance is about drawing a line in the sand and saying we're going to hold that line even in the face of threat. And this week we saw an incredible act of resistance that I want to share with you and draw it into the larger picture of resistance, because it just so happens that this act of resistance happened on the 45th anniversary of another hugely important act of resistance by ordinary workers who in those days were defying a belligerent American government threatening our nation and our way of life. So let's break this down. You may or may not have heard the news that Canada's airline attendants went on strike. They were immediately ordered back to work by our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and they refused to go back, which meant that they were facing jails and massive fines, and they held the line because they were holding the line on a principle. And both the Prime Minister and Air Canada panicked, and lo and behold, they got a deal. So what was the issue at hand? Well, you probably don't know. There's been so much frustration with people flying and problems with delays and problems on planes where you're sitting on the tarmac. And the people who get all that abuse are the airline attendants. And they're not paid to take that abuse. They don't get paid for the work they do in the boarding of people and making sure that the elderly and people who are in wheelchairs are safely put on board. They don't get paid for the time that people are deboarding. And remember how frustrated you feel when you're sitting waiting to dock at the airport and we're waiting and waiting and waiting for the crews to come. Well, they're not getting paid for that time either. And they're not getting paid to keep people relaxed and deal with people who are angry and frustrated. So this time of not being paid from the moment they come to work to the moment they finish results in about 1 week of free work every month of the year that the airline attendants have to give Air Canada. That's just bloody unfair. You know, it reminds me of back in the day here in Northern Ontario and Northern Canada when the miners were only paid for the time they were actually down underground and working the drills and not paid for the time it meant to get there, to get prepared, to take the long trips into the mines. Those miners fought to change those conditions. And here in 2025, airline attendants are only being paid for the time that the plane flies and the plane lands. That's just not on. So they went on strike. And so what were they facing? Well, Prime Minister Mark Carney, newly elected, has a huge level of popularity. He also has the backing of the Canadian people because we're seeing this time as a national emergency and we all have to be on the same page. We all have to go along. So he immediately got his Labour Minister, Minister Patty Hadju, to invoke Section 107 of Canada's Labour Code. Now, Section 107 gives the government the power to force workers back to the jobs. What we've seen over the last number of years is the Liberal government under Prime Minister Trudeau exploited Section 107 to quite the degree. So this became a moment that was going to be a line in the sand. Number one, those airline attendants said, we're not going back to work for free. You can jail us, you can fine us, but we're going to defy you. And people were shocked. What was going to happen? What was the Prime Minister going to do? But Canada's Labour movement also realized this was another line in the sand moment because they've seen the exploitation of the Labour Code used again and again by the government to the disadvantage of fair bargaining and fair rights for workers. So we all held our breath and wondered, are we going to see the airline attendants being dragged off to jail? And lo and behold, the government panicked. Air Canada panicked. For our UK viewers, there was lots of humor online about whether Labour Minister Patty Hadju would out-survive the lettuce, and we all know that when you invoke the lettuce principle, the lettuce always wins, so the Minister of Labour wilted. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing because if we are going to stand up at this time and face the threat of the gangster regimes, we can't use it as an excuse to throw our values under the bus, to undermine labor rights and workers. We have to say, if we're going to stand up for Canada, we're standing up for principles that we all believe in, and the right to collective bargaining, the right to fair wages, a right to be paid for the time that you work is part of those values. That's what separates us from the gangster regime. Who knows what Donald Trump would have done if he was defied? But we know the Canadian workers were willing to go to the wall, and that's a good thing. I did mention that this is the anniversary of a historic line in the sand moment, and I want to bring this up to you, and I want to share a video that I made when I was speaking recently in Oshawa. Oshawa is an auto workers town. Oshawa is on the front line of the fight with Trump, with the attacks on Canadian auto sector and Canadian jobs. In 1980, the Hudai workers in Oshawa, they didn't just go on strike. They walked into the plant, they took it over, they locked the gates, and they hung out a sign that said, "Day one until hell freezes over." Why did they do that? They did that because at that time, Ronald Reagan was leading a full-on assault on the North American working class. Union jobs were being decimated. Bosses were going after agreements and ripping them up. And we had the junk bond raiders, the great gift that Ronald Reagan gave the world, which of course gave us in the end the kind of gangster capitalism that we are dealing with today. And this company, KKR, walked in and announced that they weren't going to run the Canadian plant anymore. They were going to strip it of its assets, and they weren't going to pay the workers the money that they were owed. That was a line in the sand moment. I want to share with you the talk I gave with the auto worker families in Oshawa. And I'm really proud to say that in September I'll be back meeting with auto workers and their families in Oshawa, because this is the resistance. We got to meet where people are. We got to meet the front line of resistance. So I want to share this video with you, and you can see that what was happened this week in terms of standing up for worker rights is part of a long tradition, and that tradition is something we have to defend. We have to hold the line again and again and again. Otherwise, the gangsters and the oligarchs are going to come for us. So watch the film. So let's go to the Oshawa story. So in 1980, Ronald Reagan, who ran on Make America Great Again. He had the first line, yeah. They decided that the American working class had to get used to lower wages. That was the plan. So they drove interest rates through the roof, first to 13%, causing the biggest bleed off of jobs since the Depression. But it still wasn't enough. Then they drove interest rates to 20%. At 20%, people are defaulting on their mortgages. They're not buying cars. You're seeing now millions of jobs breaking across the United States. That's when Ronald Reagan went after the air traffic controllers, firing 11,000 highly trained workers and blacklisting them from ever working again. That was the signal to go at the American labor movement, to break the whole movement that had gone from 1945. And if you look at any economic graph ever, you see from 1946, 1947 up to 1980, a steady upward chart. That was the birth of the middle class. That was it, so someone working at GM could get a vacation. You know, when I was young, and I don't think I'm that old, I still got my hair, but it's gone gray. Most of the folks that I knew, one-income household. They had a car. They went away for 2 weeks. Their kids went to university and paid their university debt with a summer job. Then in 1980, that upward graph stops dead, and then it starts to descend. And that's when we talk about the starting of the free trade and then the offshoring of the jobs. So in 1980, the industrial manufacturing base
of North America is disintegrating. Hundreds of thousands of jobs. Steel's going down. Textiles going down. They lost 200,000 jobs in auto. And then they brought in deregulation of finance markets, and they brought in the junk bond raiders. So the junk bond raiders were the kings of the 1980s. They would take over a company, strip it of assets, fire the workers, leave the place in debt, and they were considered the model of the new American capitalism. And why do I say this? Because the first major showdown with the junk bond capitalists was right here in Oshawa, when they took over Hudai Industries. Now, Hudai Industries had been there for decades on Buffalo and Oshawa, supplying the big three. But it got taken over by KKR, which were the king of the junk bond bandit raiders. And they decided that they were going to shut the Ontario plant down. They'd just gotten a big grant of money from the federal government. They were going to pocket the money. They were going to leave Ontario, and they weren't going to pay the workers anything. And this is when we are losing 400,000 jobs in Ontario. So nobody's paying attention to what's happening at Hudai. And Local 222, they walk in there, they lock the plant gates, they put up a sign that says day one until hell freezes over. They were not going to go down without a fight. And then it was realized that what was in the plant was necessary to keep the production at the big three going. So after about a week, Chrysler, Ford, GM start to panic. So they start saying to UAW here and Bob White, you guys got to open that plant or we're going to lose the entire auto sector. And they said not a single thing leaves the plant unless our workers get protected. And in that moment of massive economic loss and uncertainty, workers from across the region came to Hudai to block the plant gates. Nothing moves until we get a deal. And we had a conservative government then, Bill Davis. After 2 weeks, Bill Davis said, enough. KKR is going to pay the severances. They're going to pay what's owed. And they rewrote the labor laws of Ontario so that if your plant goes down today, you are entitled to get the severances that you are owed. That's because Oshawa held the line. And at that time, as they were watching the disintegration of the manufacturing class, Bob White and crew decided they were going to bring in a no concessions policy. No concessions was insane, right? You've got plants that are just barely hanging on, and they come back to the workers and say, well, we'll keep your 700 jobs, but you're going to have to take a cut in pay, or you're not going to get what we agreed to. And UAW Canada said, no concessions. And I remember talking to Sam Gindin from the auto workers, and he said to me, we knew this was crazy. We knew we were going to lose a lot of jobs. But we knew that if we bent, they would keep coming back for more, and they would break us. So we had to hold the line. So in 1984, 36,000 GM workers walked off the job here because they wouldn't accept the agreement that was agreed to by the UAW in the United States. And oh my God, they were attacked in the press as being irresponsible, and GM said they were going to shut the Canadian operations and leave. And Bob White and the workers here said no concessions. And then something extraordinary happened. Ordinary Canadians said, hell man, we stand with the auto workers. We're tired of being pushed around. And GM came back to the table. So why is this story important? Because if you look at what happened to the American industrialized working class under Reagan when they bent, and they agreed to concessions, and they tried to cut deals. In the 1970s, the unionized rate in the United States was 25% of all workers. Now it's 6%. That's lower than it was in the age of the robber baron capitalists at the turn of the century. In Canada, it was 31%. Today it's 28% because we held the line. So I'm not saying it's going to be easy. We are facing a serious, serious threat. But if we start giving concessions to a gangster, we can guarantee that we will become that vassal state. So your choice. And Oshawa, it is your choice more than anywhere else because you are the front line. Is do you hope for concessions? Or do you live the code that Oshawa showed, which is we don't give in, we don't kiss the ring, we stand up for what's right. You can hit us as hard as you can, but we will still be standing at the end of the day. That's your choice. Elbows up.
Okay, thanks so much for this. I'm going to just end. I did tip you off that we are going to be making a big announcement on Labor Day. Yes, we are. We are going to be joining the Midas network. We're going to be, Resistance is going to become Midas Canada. We've already started to line up a number of Midas Canada town halls, and we're starting out in Rustico, Prince Edward Island. Yes, indeed. What better place to start the new resistance from than the fishing village of Rustico? And then after that, we're going to go to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. So that's the 5th and 6th of September. Then we'll be heading across Ontario, and hopefully we're going to be getting into Saskatchewan and then into British Columbia. So we're going to keep you attuned on that. But we are launching on Labor Day because Labor Day is about the values that we have in this country. It's the values of resistance. It's the values of standing up. And it's the values of defending who we are as people, as ordinary Canadians, with our friends around the world, and defending our rights in the face of the gangsters. So, for the Resistance Network, I'm Charlie Angus.